congratulations. A name known, I'm sure, to everyone in this room, judging by the number of people who come along today to hear that talk. And I think that's because you were the chief executive of the Howard for 30 years. So we all got used to expecting you to be there, telling us what's really going on for most of our lives, 30 years. So you're a very familiar name, although obviously fewer of us have heard you speak. She's also, of course, been a non-executive governor of an NHS trust, a university governor, and a trustee of various charities. She'll talk to us today about democracy mattering and creating a Senate. And I hope you will all welcome her. Thank you.
Recently, who's a very eminent professor at LSE, and I introduced myself to him. He said, "Oh, are you the person who used to be Francis Crook?" I dropped this one. Come on, this one. Can you hear me? Yes. Now they say don't start with an apology, but I am going to start with an apology because I've had a chest infection. And my oxygen levels are low, so if I sort of fade away, scrape me out of the floor and I'm fine. I'm going to start with a quote. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it's been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those forms that have been tried. And that, of course, is Winston Churchill, and it's a cliche, but there is truth in cliches, as in 1918. The challenge for democracy is that you have to keep amending it and changing it and adapting it, and hopefully improving it. And democracy is not a simple thing. It's not just Parliament. It depends on a patchwork of institutions and organisations like this. This is very much part of our democracy. iu3a, very much. It's local government. It's the metro mayors. It's school governors, voluntary organisations. And involves a lively and robust independent voluntary sector at local and national level. It involves challenge at every level. All of this creates a delicate balance between Parliament and the people, with power and with influence diffused throughout the country. Of course, legislative and leadership power rests in Parliament, with the executive being when most power is definitely concentrated. And we've seen that recently with the way that these 7 members of Parliament were treated who voted against the executive. The dominance of the Prime Minister and the executive has grown over recent decades and has led to some argue the UK has become executive sovereignty rather than parliamentary sovereignty. Executive overreach during the pandemic included awarding massively lucrative contracts, promoting friends, introducing legislation that curtailed our civil liberties. This means that investing in the parliamentary element and making sure it's strong, robust and healthy is vital. Now we have yet to see how the Commons will hold the executive to account with the new government, particularly now that one party has such a massive majority. There's always danger in that. So this makes the role of the second chamber increasingly important. The Lords itself is, of course, an anachronism. It's overpopulated. It includes people placed there not because of their ability and political expertise, but because they donated huge sums of money to one particular party. 27 major donors to the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson abused his power to put people in the Lords and created 86 new peerages of his cronies. It's made the Lords and our parliamentary system look corrupt and look ridiculous. This cannot be allowed to continue. I want to just remind you how awful things have been, although you probably don't need reminding, but it's worth repeating. The cronyism, the corruption, the incompetence, the lies. Some of it revealed during the COVID inquiry, which I followed on and off, and has been deeply depressing. It showed how deliberate inequality and poverty resulted in people dying. Government was not working for anyone but their friends, the chosen few. We saw public services collapsing. We saw attacks on institutions that protect our rights, our human rights, our civil liberties, and deliver services, attacks on the BBC, attacks on human rights organisations, international and domestic, local government. So 2 years ago, when I retired from the Howard League, with the person who used to be Francis Crook, I looked around to see what other small contribution I could make to the life of the country. I worked for 30 years, dealing with government at every level, and all sorts of different governments. And I wanted to use that experience of working with government in a constructive way. I was very lucky because one of the big donors to the Howard League, a man called Richard Sands, the hi-fi shop, he's a great philanthropist. He said, and it's the most wonderful thing anyone's ever said to me, he said, well, think of something to do and I'll fund it. So this is what I thought. I've set up something called the Commission on Political Power. And I've been working with Baroness Frances de Souza, who was the former Lord Speaker. And I thought two Franceses bound to be formidable. It's still quite an unusual name. So we're co-conveners. And my commissioners are Graham Allen, who's the former Labour MP and chair of the Constitution Committee in the Commons. Tim Bale, who's Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. He's very active on social media, those of you who do that. Dominic Grieve, KC, who's a former Conservative MP and former Attorney General, an all-round good guy. Alexandra Hall, so good they named her twice. And she's a former ambassador who, to Georgia and number 10 advisor. She resigned from Boris's government over the way he was implementing all the EU legislation. Simon Israel from Channel 4 News, Kevin McGrath, who's a businessman, Pragma Patel, who's a founder of Southall Black Sisters, Rory Stewart, who I'm sure you'll know all about, Conservative Secretary of State and current podcaster. And Polly Toynbee is a Guardian columnist and commentator. So we have quite a group of people. And I've got Hardy Matharu, who's the editor of Byline Times, is our researcher. She drafts our papers for us. So there's a group of people who don't always agree on everything. So a lot of the papers we've written have not come out with a list of recommendations, because we like herding cats, I'd never get them all to agree. But we come up with ideas and suggestions, some of which you can do like a pick and mix. So you can put some of them together that would make a difference. All our papers are short, because nobody ever reads long reports. I think I'm the only person in the world that's read Gordon Brown's long report on the Constitution. They're short. They're on the website. I brought some hard copies of this one for you. So we came together to work rather like a select committee to consider a series of structural issues that were in need of reform. So it's sort of central structural stuff, a bit techy. And we try to contribute to trigger informed debate with ideas for change and that's why I'm here. We published papers on corruption, political funding, increasing citizens' engagement with political power, reform of the executive, ideas for changing the head of state, which was very contentious in my group, because some people were very strong monarchists and some people were not. So you've got Rory Stewart on one side and Polly Toynbee on the other. And I came in somewhere in the middle. But the paper I was asked to talk about today was the creation of the Senate. So, as you can imagine, with my disparate group of commissioners, not everybody agreed with everything. But we've come up with a list of options and ideas for how reform of the laws could be done in a way which would make things better. It is slightly ironical that the Lords actually is a part of the central government in recent years that has functioned reasonably well. This was despite, not because of its composition. And the abject failure of the Commons under the previous government to hold the government to account. Does it keep going up and down? Yes. That's because I keep moving my head. I'll try not to move my head so much. The abject failure of the Commons under the previous well, up and down is better than nothing at all. Right, okay. So the abject failure of the Commons under the previous government to hold the government to account meant that the Lords was left to struggle on alone, vainly attempting to uphold the rule of law and protect the rights of citizens. The new government, the Labour government, has made several, if rather feeble, indications that it will change. Prior to the election, Keir Starmer asked Gordon Brown to look at the Constitution and to come up with ideas for reform. He brought together a team of constitutional experts and wrote a very long report back then. It suggested something called an Assembly of Nations and Regions, and there was talk of a new body being created. But in the King's speech, the only provision was to abolish the hereditary peers. Nothing else. None of the other ideas from Gordon Brown's paper at all. So it's not exactly radical. I'm not surprised at the idea of creating a whole new chamber directly elected on PR, proportional representation, or regional proportional representation was not introduced and was not popular. It would be a major constitutional change, and the balance of power between the new chamber and the Commons would have to be considered. And this government has a whole list of major changes it's making, and I don't think they just didn't want to do constitutional reform on that level. So what my commission has suggested are more subtle changes that build on what's working well in the current laws, but will give it more legitimacy. And that's very important. Through indirect elections. So we're not suggesting a directly elected chamber. We're suggesting people get legitimacy through being indirectly elected. So let me take you through, very briefly, 9 suggestions. 1, we call it a Senate. Immediately it becomes a legislative body. It looks like a legislative body. It doesn't look like a series of alcoholic bars, parties, or a sinecure, or somewhere you just ponce about wearing robes. Senators would be legislators and should have a job description. At the moment, no politicians have job descriptions. MPs don't have job descriptions, members of the cabinet don't, the Prime Minister doesn't. But it would be quite a thing to have senators with a job description. Secondly, the purpose of the Senate should be very clear and set out. It should be to uphold and protect the Constitution and the rights of citizens, to hold the government to account, to review, scrutinise and improve legislation, and to provide expertise, and this is a bit optimistic, and to provide wisdom. there are some very wise members in the House of Lords, and we want to keep that. I'm not sure I'd say exactly the same about the Commons, but yeah, give them a chance. So the Senate would complement, not conflict or duplicate the Commons. Work with the Commons. It would be very important that the Senate conducts detailed scrutiny of legislation prior to legislation coming in, during the legislative process, and post-legislative scrutiny. It's all very technical, but really important. It's important we get our laws right. We've had a lot of laws brought in that have been a right mess because they're shoved through the Commons really quickly. They're not scrutinised or thought about. The committee system in the Commons is inadequate, and it sometimes comes out a right mess. In my own field, what we've ended up with at the IPPs, if you've seen that, and that was a right mess. Thirdly, on the composition, it's very big at the moment, and it doesn't need to be that big. And there's a lot of people don't turn up anyway. They're just there because they can say they're taking the restaurant with their title. So we need to have it around about the same as the Commons, maybe a bit smaller, 400 to 500 people. Now, it's possible to achieve representative democracy without direct elections. This is the contentious bit. It is possible to have regional representation without direct elections. So our suggestion is that you have, as part of the normal composition of the Senate, the directly elected mayors would sit automatically. Instead of the bishops who would not sit, bishops, and not have people there representing one or other religion, they could come through a different route. But you'd have a rotation of local government leaders. So they would be directly elected locally, but then indirectly elected into the Senate. You could have the head of the BMA, the head of several trade unions, so professional bodies would be represented. So you'd have a group of people who've all been elected, but not directly elected, they're indirectly elected. You would then have other professionals who could sit in, who would have to go through scrutiny, adhere to the Nolan principles, and would go to a very powerful appointments committee with members of the public, old and young, anybody. So they would make sure, the appointments committee would make sure that they are representative, that that's where you would get different faith groups represented, and all sorts of different people represented, and to sit for a specific amount of time in the Lords. Now, I actually think people should sit for quite a long time, because learning how to do legislation is very complicated. And it's no good being there for 2 years because you wouldn't know what you were doing. You'd never find your way around all the building anyway. As most of the new MPs are finding, they keep getting lost. But you need to be there for 10, 15, 20 years. See what that would be. So you get the functional constituencies, people who have expertise, current expertise in the laws as part of the legislative process. You would get representatives from educational bodies, from vocational, scientific communities, real expertise in the Senate. They would have to be living in this country, and they would have to pay UK tax, and they would have to go through a proper check to make sure that they have integrity.
Extend that because I conservative that are like, well, I didn't
Hello? The appointments process itself, there would have to be an independent appointments commission. I mean, there is already one, but it's not very independent and it's not on a proper statutory footing. So we could make that more robust. Lord Norton has said how that could work, and he came to give us evidence and talk to us. And as I said, it should be around about 400, maybe 500 people. That would be enough. We too think the hereditary peers should go. Funnily enough, actually, some of the hereditary peers are really good and they work very hard and they're very able. But you can't justify it being there just because you happen to be the son of the son of the son of the son of stolen a lot of land somewhere up north. It's just not on. And as I've said, also the bishops should go because having one religion represented is not appropriate anymore in this country. Number 8 is term limits. There should be term limits. And again, weirdly, some of the people that have been there for a long time, and some of the people who are really quite old, I have to say, I had lunch, what day is it today? Thursday. I had lunch on Tuesday with Alf Doss, who is 91 and absolutely wonderful. And he was making speeches on the King's Speech on a couple of things, on constitutional issues and on crime. Brilliant. Nevertheless, there need to be time limits and prolongations. Finally, what we said is that the people need support. You cannot function appropriately if you haven't got an office and a functioning computer and staff, research staff and administrative staff. Now, none of this actually is expensive. Having elections is quite expensive, so if you have an elected body, that does cost a lot of money. But having functional constituencies and people who are there indirectly elected, this is not expensive. So Parliament has existed in various forms for over 1,000 years. It's grown and changed incrementally. We did have a revolution, but it was a while back. We can build on this, and we can make it better. And my Commission on Political Power recognises and respects the history of Parliament. And we think that ideas could be introduced steadily and bring greater accountability and legitimacy to the existing institution. We do need the second chamber. Every big democracy does have two chambers. You need that counterbalance and challenge and scrutiny from two separate chambers functioning in slightly different ways. Government is a serious business, and it needs serious people with expertise and knowledge. Making laws is complicated, and legislators need research support and administrative support. With the disarray of the last government and the corruption cannot be allowed to happen again. A new framework and a new policy and a new purpose needs to help protect our parliamentary and legislative system. I'm disappointed that the King's Speech didn't include some of these ideas. We're going to make a party conference with a fringe meeting, and I will be talking to members of Parliament. Hopefully they will take on board some of our ideas over the next 5 years, even if it's not right at the beginning of the Parliament. Constitutional reform needs to happen because we can't carry on having a House of Lords just the way it is for years and years to come. It has to change. So what we need to do is we need to get it right, because if we mess it up, things can go very badly wrong. So I hope our ideas are taken on board. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about it, because we want to take on new ideas and present those. So now I want to hear from you. Sorry. I've still got this. And I'll try not to complain about it.
Okay, so, oh yes, hands springing up. There's one at the back, yes? You start with the back and move forward.
you talked about protecting the Constitution. Do we have one?
Sort of. I mean, I suppose when I talked about, I mean, we don't have a written constitution like a lot of European states do, the Napoleonic idea. But we do have a constitution. We have a parliamentary system, we have institutions, we have an understanding of how things work. And I think we saw that when the Johnson government prorogued Parliament, if you remember, and the court said, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. So there are balances, there are constitutional frameworks, and if you have explicitly written into a new Senate's purpose that they are there to protect the Constitution, it gives a sense that we have one. And I think that even that is a step towards recognising them. We're not suggesting there should be a written constitution, although I'll admit something I don't normally tell people. I'm a Cromwellian. And when Cromwell was made Lord Protector, I'm also a historian, he introduced something called an instrument of government, which he said would make the relationship between the Protectorate and Parliament clear. So it wasn't a constitution, but it was the relationship between the two instruments of government, because he didn't want to be like the king, an overwhelming power. So we could perhaps have an instrument of government which sets out the relationships rather than having a whole written constitution that, Cromwell.
Now, I've got more questions. I'm going to actually, after this, Margaret, I'll ask one question here, and then there's a gentleman at the back who put his hand up very speedily. So stay there for the moment, because we can move on quickly to somebody on this side who wants to ask a question. There's somebody there.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk and very enlightening. With regard to legislation, would the new body continue to interpret only legislation that comes from the House? Or would they be empowered to introduce new legislation in the light of the new contributions they'd be making?
Interesting question, because legislation actually comes from the executive. It doesn't come from Parliament. Bills are introduced by the executive. Sometimes they're put into Parliament, into the Commons first. Occasionally they're put into the Lords first. But Parliament does not write its own legislation. Parliament, neither the Commons nor the Lords, at the moment, control their own agenda, their own timetable. They control very little. So I think it would be unlikely that you would allow either the Commons or a Senate to introduce its own legislation. What I would like to see as a counterbalance to that is more power to committees. The other bit of the parliamentary system that works really well is the committees, the select committees. And I think giving them more power to hold ministers to account, secretaries of state to account, on what they do, and more scrutiny of the legislation that's being proposed before it comes, would be possible. Of course, the only other way that legislation can come from down up rather than that way, is private members' bills, but they're so rare, and they're bills particular things. I don't think there's any other way that Parliament makes its own legislation. I may be wrong, somebody's a constitutional expert here, but I don't think there is.
Thank you.
Two things. One, more power to your elbow. Two,
Sorry, what?
I said more power to your elbow.
Oh, thank you.
Number two, I looked for a Wikipedia page about your organisation and I couldn't find one. I think you need one if you've not got one. That's it.
Wikipedia? No, I haven't got a Wikipedia. That's good. You've got a website. There's no Wikipedia page. I'll do one. Thank you.
Oh, look, there's another one at the back there, Margaret, and then we will move down to the front.
Thank you. I found your talk absolutely fascinating, as I'm sure most people have. but nevertheless, it may not be well balanced, but it does have representatives of all political faiths there. Maybe well not distributed. The Senate, which you are proposing, might it in any way reflect, I mean, should it in part reflect, I don't know, I just asked a question, the political makeup of the Commons?
That's a good question. I mean, I think probably you'd have to allow the government of the day to put their own people. You need ministers in there to answer in the Senate, to represent the government. So you would have to have the government of the day putting people in. They would have to conform to integrity, probity, and appropriateness. And actually what's been interesting is that the people, the experts that have been put into the Lords to deal with things like prisons have conformed to that. So you would not be able, the government of the day would not be able to put their brother in, which did happen, or, you know, their mistress. I'm not going to comment on that. But you're right. The other question which I think is complicated and linked to that, and I haven't got an answer for, is the whip system. Because if you would have political people in there, party people, and you would have ministers, and if you don't have some kind of a whip system, it's chaos. I mean, I think you need some kind of a whip system that allows people to dissent, but you have to have a system of organising people. I mean, even the non-aligned peers at the moment have a whipping system, so they know what's going on. Otherwise, you don't know what's happening in the chamber. So there are questions still, I think, to be answered about the composition of the political parties in a new chamber, and how they would work with the whips and how strong the whips would be. And I don't know the answers to that. I think they're very difficult questions.
Thank you. You mentioned about regional mayors being in the Senate. Don't they have enough to do in their locations while they're in office? Or perhaps even after retirement? And secondly, about the term or age limit, as you say, some people are much more able, age kind of, it is not always and neither is a term always could there be some kind of competency, like in a job? No, I'm serious, like in a job, you can't carry on in your job if you become incompetent, or if you don't attend.
Yes, that's a good point. I mean, as we've seen in perhaps another country, the question of competency in high office is difficult to get rid of people sometimes, isn't it? You really need to stand down, Mr. Biden. You really need to go. The question about mayors, as far as I understand it, in Germany, which is a federal country, so the leaders of the Landers sit automatically in the second chamber of the Bundestag. But they don't have to sit themselves. They can nominate a deputy. And if you think of our mayors, they have a lot of deputies who have specific responsibilities for things. So that would be a possibility. They could nominate a deputy to sit in the second chamber, in the Senate. Alternatively, they could sit themselves. I mean, of course, there is a mayor, Ben Hoochen, who sits in the Lords, as well as being a mayor, an elected mayor. He sits himself. So it does happen. So there are different ways of doing it. And the question about terms, what we've come up with is terms which would be overlapping. So you wouldn't have everybody up for election, because you'd have people, so the head of the BMA would sit as far as they're the head of the BMA. And then when they're not, the new person would come in. The people who are there nominated as members of the public would sit for, say, 20 years, but they would be not all of the same 20 years, so there would be a constant churn of people. I also quite like the idea that people have two jobs. I like that. I think it's very positive So they go away and they're a doctor or they're a trade union leader or something, and they sit part-time. And they do both jobs. Actually, I quite agree. That does actually work very well in the Lords at the moment and brings in the real life experience so that politicians are more grounded in different professions and expertise than perhaps most of the Commons are, who tend to be professional politicians.
There's somebody here, John. Is that okay?
How would you ensure diversity that reflects our country when the heads of many of the sorts of organisations you mentioned tend to be male and white?
Well, actually, quite a lot of the trade union leaders are women now, and they're really good. Quite forceful women. But you're right, and it needs to be protected, which is why I think if you take the bishops out, you could have representatives of different faiths. And that would be very explicitly part of the committee which would look at representation, so that there was proper representation across age, ethnicity, regional, everything needs to be brought in, which is one of the reasons why I didn't like Gordon Brown's idea of just regional elections, because that tends to be, you get certain groups of people and they're politicians. And we don't always want to be run by politicians. So I think having very explicitly, as part of the process, making sure that there are balances in and representation of minorities, of all kinds of people who are minorities, is very important. 1, 2, 3 questions here.
Did you discuss limiting the numbers of peerages that a retiring Prime Minister can appoint?
Oh, that wouldn't be possible at all. Get rid of that completely. And we don't want any cronies in. No, they couldn't just abolish that. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting that they get a Prime Minister can nominate people for all sorts of honours. Outrageous. No way. Just don't do it.
I have the mic already. I may have missed it. I'm not quite clear how the composition of the chamber would be determined. Would they be a sort of, like an overriding management committee who would look at selection and the issues of diversity, etc. And just a second point is it's really refreshing to hear you talk about experts being involved in the second chamber, since experts were not highly thought of in the past government, and also the fact that we need the people working there will need the backup of administrative staff, etc. Because again, given what's happened in all government departments and sort of being remotely involved with the MOJ, the way that's been decimated and there is no support, the effect that's had on the court system, it's refreshing to hear you talk about it actually reintroducing that.
Well, what we've suggested is there should be a statutory, put on proper statutory appointments commission. So you apply to go there, you apply for a job, and there's a job description, and you fill in an application. And you have to fulfill certain criteria. So you have to be a taxpayer, you have to show integrity, you have to show that you've proven skill, expertise, so that there will be an appointments process which is transparent to allow give notice to the public, but anybody who goes in, nominated by government or nominated from outside or even indirectly elected, they would have to fulfill certain criteria based on integrity, which is really important. And so it would be done through an appointments commission and a job description.
Thank you. For a long time, I've been worried about, thinking about our wonderful Phil Society organisations, the big charities, the campaign organisations, which all seem to be outside Parliament. And it seems to me that there would be a place for them in the Senate, and they would actually represent all the citizens. We know what country understand the issue, there's much more about it than it's in the DMPs. And I wonder if you agree with that. I've always thought that maybe 1/3 should go to civil society organisations, and it would of course include some of the churches.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that civil society, and we have an incredibly robust civil society in this country. I think the voluntary organisations as a whole represent a bigger part of the economy than agriculture. I mean, it's just massive. So I absolutely agree with that. And I just remembered the phrase that Lord Norton suggested which should be the criteria for judging who goes. And the individuals should show conspicuous merit. And I quite like that. I quite like that. So anybody who goes in should be able to show conspicuous merit. But yes, obviously coming from the voluntary sector, I think I should have been in the Lords long ago.
Any more questions? There's two over here.
I'm wondering, is there going to be, or do you anticipate, a small group of people at the top of the Senate who could give an overall view of what the Senate has decided or how they discuss certain issues? Because how do the views of the Senate travel either to the Commons or out to the public?
That's very technical. Also, that's when you get things like the whips and ministers and groups of people and committees. So they travel backwards and forwards in various different ways. The Lords has lots of very good committees and some joint committees, of course, with the Commons. The Human Rights Committee is a joint committee. So things go backwards and forwards that way. But directly to government will be through ministerial responsibility. So you would have ministers in the Senate.
I'm just wondering if there might be a lower age limit. I'm only thinking that young people should be represented. They might not have wisdom, but they have certain perspective and different priorities. And I think that to increase diversity, it also increases age, does it not?
That's a very good point. And I keep changing my mind about voting at 16. I think it's an interesting one. Although my 5-year-old granddaughter has the answer to everything. She is terrified. On the one hand, I think you're right, the young people, even 16-year-olds, have very important contributions to make. On the other hand, legally, I like the idea that under 18 are children and deserve special protection. So it's a very complicated thing. I think there perhaps are other ways of representing, so that there are youth parliaments, for example, who could be given a greater feed into a Senate in a more structural way, which I think might be the way to deal with it. I know that the Speaker holds youth parliaments actually in the parliamentary building. That might be one way of doing it, but you're absolutely right, young people who don't get a say. And one of the changes that's been suggested, and it keeps getting lost, is parliamentary constituencies should be based on population, not the electorate. And that would be a way of making sure that an elected member of something separate to the Senate, a member of Parliament then represents their whole population. So those are people who have a vote and who don't. Something separate.
And one right at the back, Mark. Over beyond.
I'm entitled to another question. Did you discuss ping pong? This is where the laws are set up at back to the Commons. But eventually, like in my understanding, the rule. Did you discuss ping pong?
No, we didn't discuss ping pong or any others than the tabletop sports. But it is an issue. I think even in our structure, the Commons would have primacy. And I think one of the problems with having a directly elected second chamber is who would have primacy. And arguably, particularly if you have a second chamber which is elected on proportional representation grounds, the balance would be skewed. And they would be able to argue, rightly or wrongly, that they had greater legitimacy than and chamber are elected on constituencies. In the end, the Commons has to have primacy. And actually, Bingham has quite we saw prior to the election, where the Lords was challenging legislation very forcefully and very democratically. And I think that would still happen. I can't see any way out of that, unless you can, which would be very interesting to hear.
Any other questions? Yes, you've got one, yeah.
It's a supplementary one.
Yes.
I think my point is, part of my point in wanting to have civil society organisations in the Senate is that they can have a voice and perhaps put things on the agenda, because I think a lot of people are frustrated that what their concerns are just not discussed because they're not. And then new government ever comes up with new ideas later on that actually start something empowering. And this idea of people being able to express the things that they want something done about, I think would be very good for the nation.
I think putting, as part of the sort of professional elected representatives, members of civil society, I think would be difficult because at the moment there's a limited number of voluntary organisations which have statutory powers. The RSPCA does, NSPCC does, Oxfam doesn't. So to nominate particular voluntary organisations to have representatives in the Senate, I think you couldn't have. But I think as part of the process for making sure that there's a balance and it's representative, that the Senate is representative, civil society would form a core element of that, because it's part of anything, because it's such a big part of the economy, and really important to have it say. So I think that would have to be part of this general mainline.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Any more questions? If not, I'd like to thank you very, very much.